Hello, I'm Brian Lucareli, Director of our Private Client Services Group and co-chair of our Family Offices team at Foley and Lardner. And today I'm here with Natalie Annis, a partner and member of our Family Offices team. Welcome, Natalie.
Hi, Brian.
So today we will discuss estate planning for personal collections and tangible assets. And I know those are big names that you're going to distill for us. But Natalie, before you jump into this, could you give the audience a little background on you professionally?
Sure. I work with individuals, couples, families with a variety of backgrounds and nature of assets and net worths to preserve and transition their wealth to their heirs using both lifetime strategies and strategies that we implement at death.
Perfect. So let's get started. I've developed some questions based on your background. So we're all familiar with clients who have a passion for their personal collections, many of which contain unique items, very unique to them sometimes. But why should clients give special consideration to these assets in their estate plan?
I think that the first reason really applies across the board, regardless of the background, the nature, the value, and it really is family harmony. So if you think that you have all of these assets and that they're going to just naturally go to the person to whom they belong, it just doesn't usually work out that way. So for clients, a lot of times we spend time focusing on there things we can easily identify, especially as a lawyer, because we can look at a balance sheet or financial statement and say, okay, you have a family business, you have these marketable securities, real estate. And sometimes we kind of gloss over the tangible personal property, maybe because the client doesn't seem to have anything of value, or maybe because we just don't have time or ask the right questions. And then sometimes we find out that, in fact, they did have things that were important, both from a monetary standpoint, but really very, very often they just family members get really, really upset about how these things pass. And again, regardless of the monetary value, and it's just because it's tying them to their lost loved one. And so if you can try to address these things in advance, that they usually there will be more family harmony, hopefully, when you do so.
Well, excellent point on the family harmony point. In your practice, you probably see this with every client, regardless of their net worth. But what about clients with valuable collections? And what additional considerations are important for them, if you can share some of your insights with that?
So, right. So when we're talking about valuable collections, we're usually talking about there's a larger monetary value, maybe in addition to the sentimental value. So it's important to understand that these assets are subject to estate tax, just like all of the other assets I just mentioned. And again, it's difficult because they don't have an ascertainable value. It's a lot of times much harder to determine, and it changes over time. So they're difficult to plan with. And but just as an example, and just to kind of orientate you and everyone, as you know, there's an estate tax due 9 months after the date of death when there's assets that have a value that warrants estate tax. And so you have 9 months to come up with the tax that's due, and you're still trying to value assets and figure these things out. So anything that you can do in advance to plan for these assets that are hard to value, assets that are hard to protect, quite frankly, they disappear, they can be located in different homes across the country. I mean, it's very, very challenging, especially when the client hasn't put a lot of thought to it in the first place. So it's important to do as much as you can to plan both for the easy transition of those assets and getting them where you want them to go, but also there could be some significant tax consequences to owning those and dying with those assets.
So great points. 9 months is not a long time. So pragmatically, what initial steps should a client take?
Well, I think you got to start at the beginning, and the beginning is identifying the assets. So putting together an inventory or a catalog if it's something that's easy to do. It's much easier to identify something by a picture than it is by a verbal, this diamond bracelet. Well, what if you have five? So it's much easier to do that. And it takes a lot of work. And that's why a lot of times these things don't get accomplished, because it's sort of over there on the side. These are things that people are enjoying, and they're not really thinking about them always as
Right.
something with a lot of values. So putting together a catalog, and we talk about collections, and a lot of times we're thinking about art because it typically has a higher monetary value, but this applies to all kinds of things: wine collections, jewelry, sports memorabilia, things that people
Right.
just sometimes aren't thinking about. So putting together a list, a catalog of all the assets. And when you're talking about art, pulling bills of sale, appraisals, anything on insurance, any of the information that's available, and really documenting the ownership of these assets and trying to determine the value. And it seems pretty straightforward if you have a couple that's been married for 50 years, but when you have some other facts where you have a second marriage, children from prior marriages, there's a premarital agreement involved, sometimes what your wishes are not consistent with what's in the agreement or the underlying premise in the agreement or the default provision. So you really do need to document who owns it, how is it, what's the value, and then try to determine the value so that you can figure out what planning you're going to do when someone passes away. So documentation and valuation. And valuation is challenging because things change over time. So you just kind of have to start where you are and try to determine some range of value.
So definitely a level of complexity, but once they have the appropriate documentation regarding ownership and value, how do you help with planning and transferring these assets to the heirs?
Well, I'm a big proponent of open dialogue, and that is as it relates to estate planning in general, but I think with tangible personal property, especially because these mismanaged expectations going both directions. A family member may think, the client may think that their grandchild really wants this, that, or the other, or their child does, and sometimes they're just wrong. And it can be so much better if you have an open dialogue and conversation, even though it might not be what anyone wants to do, because we don't really like to talk about death and people don't want to seem greedy, but it really is, if you're talking about something with value, it's just really prudent to have those hard conversations. And then the advisors can do a much better job with the planning if they understand what the objectives are and can give better recommendations based on what the client's family wants. So for example, if a client thinks that they're going to pass their art collection along to their children and their children have zero interest in that type of art, they may like art generally, but they just don't like their parents' particular collection. Well, then it's a scramble for the personal representatives of the estate. And sometimes they're not professional personal representatives. Sometimes they're individuals and they
Right.
don't know what to do. And it really can be very complicated and really waste a lot of resources. Also, making sure that the family knows the value of the assets. We're talking about art. It's easy. It's usually on a wall or it's an item that someone can look at. But sometimes there are assets and collections that no one knows that have that value, or it's been passed along in generations and no conversations have been had. So some of it is just to make sure that these valuable items aren't just put out for takeaway in the giveaway bin because they don't look like they have value to a younger generation who just doesn't, quite frankly, appreciate it. But that doesn't
Right.
mean it doesn't have some real monetary value. So the open conversation is really important.
I'm sure your counseling skills are put to the test, at least not daily, maybe weekly, but so what options might a client consider or additional options should they be considering?
So usually, and again, we think about this more often with art and collections like that, you're either going to leave it to charity, which is helpful from a tax planning perspective, or pass it along to the family, or direct that it be sold, or some combination of those is usually what happens. And I think it's important, if you're going to transition it to a family member or family members, putting it in some kind of entity can help. And that's part of all of the process of cataloging and detailing the ownership and really tidying things up. Using an entity can be helpful there. Also, when you're talking about the sale is going to be necessary, putting the advisors in place, letting the personal representative know. The personal representative may know nothing about that particular type of
Right.
asset, and knowing that you have a relationship with this particular art dealer, or they can be an advisor, or you want it sold at Sotheby's or whatever it is that you want. Just putting those out can save a lot of time. for getting us to that 9-month due date for the taxes, but also make sure that the asset, we want to preserve the wealth for the next generation. That's a much easier way to do it, is to make sure that we have the right advisors involved.
Valuable points. Thank you. And are there any other types of tangible personal property that will require special consideration that you've seen or deal with?
I think one that's the two, we actually have their own types of trusts for both of them. One is firearms. So typically clients will put them in what we call a gun trust, just because that's what it is. And that helps with the transition of those at a person's death. And then also pets. So increasingly pet trusts are very popular. It kind of goes in waves, and making sure that these animals, whom are our family members, can pass, and that those that receive them have the resources to care for them the same way that the client was caring for them. So the trust may be set up to have assets in it to help pay for prescription medication and food and all of those things, so that they can continue to have the same type of care. So again, these are things that are often overlooked because it's just not in the front of your mind, but they do really help with the transition when someone passes away.
And finally, before I let you go, any current developments that necessitate that our audience should be considering going forward?
Well, I think with everything going more and more digital these days, I think that's probably the biggest area of growth that we're going to see, is the value of everyone's net worth, the percentage value in digital assets is going to continue to grow. And I think, forget even art, just general accounts and things like that. If you don't have some kind of inventory or some kind of roadmap for those left behind when you pass away, those assets may just never be found, and someone else is certainly happy to take them for you. So I think it's really important, as this area of law evolves, to stay on top of it. And for estate planning attorneys, it's challenging. We have enough to stay on top of, but I think the digital asset area is going to be something that's extremely important. And hopefully, with NFTs, and I think there's going to potentially be some more help in this area for cataloging art, and maybe having a centralization of doing that down the road that could help clients. I know there's private options in that way, but hopefully something that may be a little more helpful going forward. So stay tuned.
Well,
maybe you can do another interview. Digital assets is its own interview.
I think you're totally right on that. So Natalie, I want to thank you for your time and certainly sharing your expertise with our audience today. I also want to thank our audience for watching our presentation. For more information, please visit us at foley.com under Family Offices. Thank you.